I have a question for you this morning, though. How many of y'all, I want to see a show of hands, how many of y'all speak Spanish? How many of y'all can speak Spanish? Yes. I forget that I'm not in Texas anymore. It makes it. So if I begin to speak a little Spanish, you may or may not know what I'm talking about. Now, I don't speak fluent Spanish, so don't test me later. But, simple things like, hola, me llamo Kendall, ¿cómo estás? Okay, bien. Some of y'all are there, right? All right. Estoy feliz de estar aquí. I'm happy to be here, right? All right. Husbands, write this one down and use it later. Are you ready? Mi esposa es bonita. Okay, that means my wife is beautiful. Use it as much as you can. That one's for you to say. Put it in the pocket. Mi esposa es bonita. Okay, that's a little bit for you guys later. But here's the thing. When it comes to a foreign language, it makes perfect sense that all y'all gave me that blank stare when I gave you that last statement. Like, it makes a whole lot of sense that we don't know or understand because we're not speaking the same language. But have you ever felt that way when it came to speaking English with someone? Like, if you you've been around a group of young adults or teenagers, and you're like, I just don't get what's happening. You see, Gen Z encompasses most of the generation that was born in the late 90s moving forward. And for me, being a millennial, realizing that I am not the most current generation makes me feel a little older, but that's going to be okay. But like all generations, Gen Zers have their own slang, they have their own lingo, and it can be a totally different language. Maybe you've been around it. Maybe your kids are in Gen Z and you're like, I don't even know what they're talking about. And like, if you aren't quick enough to catch on, then you might find yourself a FOMO, right? Like the fear of missing out. Okay, you'll catch up. All right, here we go. All right, but maybe you don't have any kids in your current context that are in this demographic, but maybe you've been at a coffee shop or in line at a grocery store. And it doesn't matter what generation you come from, but sometimes when we're around young adults or teenagers, it can just sound like they're just talking absolute gibberish. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. It's English, but we just don't understand, and those words and phrases can be their own language. But this is how Gen Z communicates with one another. So for you this morning, we're gonna go through a little Gen Z lingo understanding. The first word, maybe you've heard this word before, salty. You ever heard this? Now, we're not talking about some sort of food or something that has too much salt on it, like, this is salty. No, this is a term Gen Z uses when they're feeling jealous or somebody gets kind of angry or frustrated, really, like they're salty. Like, so use it that later. This is how you can embarrass your children, okay? Tell them, and then when they get embarrassed, you can tell them, quit being salty, okay? That's what it looks like. So this is a word that in our possible language that is not the same, but if they say it in that context, you're like, I don't understand what is going on. What about this word? Cap. It's not just something you wear on your head. It is a term. It's an older, but it's a still relevant term that means to lie. Okay, so like if you say no cap, that means you're being authentic and truthful. All right, so cap means to lie, no cap means to tell the truth. Pretty simple. Are you tracking with me? What about this one? Slaps. Yeah, it's weird, right? This is their language. Welcome to the club. Okay, it's used to describe something, how exceptional it is. So it has nothing to do with any sort of violence or frustration. It is saying, man, that sandwich slaps. That show slaps. Whatever it may be, it's a commandeering thing. Like, it's really good. It's exceptional. It's awesome. It slaps. As the blank stares I see, you understand where I live in, right? What about this last one? This may strike a chord with some of you. Ghosting. Now, this is commonly used in like earlier stages of relationships, but it can be used in any sort of relationship, right? It's when someone starts to ignore you or they stop responding to your text messages. So maybe some of y'all were ghosted this weekend. We don't know, but this is what Gen Z uses in some of these words, and there's so many more. But these are all we're going to look at this morning. But these are the terms that Gen Z uses to communicate. Just some of them. But the thing is, this is how non-believers, when we see these words and don't quite understand, this is how non-believers sometimes feel, the unchurched probably feel when we share the gospel with them. We kind of have our own language and our own terminology, and we can leave the exact ones who need to hear the truth of the gospel the most. We can leave them out. We leave them confused and discouraged. Paul gives us a great picture of this in Acts chapter 17. We're going to pick back up where we left off last week in Acts chapter 17, picking up in verse 16 this morning. And Paul is entering into this city of Athens. So Paul has left and he's headed to Athens, okay? And now he's all the way down here. He's by himself. He's waiting for Silas and Timothy. And he's supposed to be laying low. Why? Because if you remember from last week, he was chased out of the city from a violent mob, right? And so if a violent mob's chasing you and you run away to a different city for protection, you probably should lay low. He's probably being looked for, right? But Paul enters this time of Athens. He enters the city of Athens. Now, Athens was this kind of city center of wisdom and artistry. It was of learning, and like this is a city where all the great minds would get together. I mean, it was actually named after the goddess Athena, who was the goddess of wisdom. And so this is where they would begin to gather. And this is kind of what we walk into, but it was known for something else as well. Idols. So let's pick up in verse 16 and see what Paul has to say. It says, now while Paul was with us, or while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. The city was full of idols. Now remember, Paul's waiting here. He's supposed to be laying low. He's waiting on Silas and Timothy. He was sent alone, but because he was so provoked, because he was mad, he wasn't little mad, he was big mad, okay? Like he was so angry that he began to act. He began to speak into it. And then there's this moment that Paul, seeing all of these idols, he was so deeply troubled about the false gods that he had to say something about it. Now, a lot of times the large portions of Athens wouldn't have had very many people in it, but it probably, I mean, he would have been speaking somewhere in the Roman Forum or the Greek Agora, the marketplace there, but this is where he was. And he'd be surrounded by these great buildings. Look, like this is kind of a remock of what the city of Athens would have looked like. Can you throw that picture up there for me? So like, these are the incredible temples, these incredible buildings, the temple to Athena, the Parthenon, right? Like all of these things, these statues of their leaders would have been looking over the city. I mean, this is the place where Paul is walking into. He's surrounded by nothing but temples to false gods and idols. Petronas would have said this, that it was easier to find a god than a man in Athens. It was easier to find a god than a man in Athens. I mean, that's the city that he is in. That's how many different gods they had, and each one of them had their own temple or at least their own idol, their own statue. And so this is what Paul walked into. Like, try to put yourself in Paul's shoes as he enters this immaculate city dedicated to false gods. And Paul knows that God alone deserves this praise, so he's angry. He's saying no stone or no idol of stone or gold or silver should steal the praise from the one true God. And that's why Paul goes on to say this. In verse 17, he says, so he reasoned in the synagogues with the Jews. He reasoned with the Jews and the devout persons and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. So his approach in Athens was different from most of his cities. Like he went here, he patiently began to try to persuade people the truth about Jesus. He went to the religious people first, right? He went to the Jews and the synagogues, and then he went to the devout persons, which would be the religious Gentiles. So he said, hey, I'm going to hit the people who understand a little bit about maybe some sort of religion, and then I'm going to take it into the marketplace and address people there because they still need to know the truth as well. Now, he was alone. There were no miracles performed here in Athens, and there was no real formal establishment of any sort of church, but this is where he walked into. And so this is his approach. And as he began to talk, he began to garner attention. As you could probably imagine, hey, what is he talking about? He began to attract the attention of some philosophers. Some people were like, oh, I'm going to prove this guy wrong. And some of those were called the Epicureans and the Stoics. Look what it says in verse 18. It says, some of the Epicurean and the Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. And they said, what does this babbler wish to say? Others said, he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. Now, Paul meets with the Epicureans and the Stoics, and these were the followers of probably two of the best-known philosophy schools of the time, right? So like these were prominent people. And Epicureanism is a system of philosophy based on the teachings of Epicurus. Okay, there's not going to be a quiz, all right, but there it is, Epicurus. All right, it's not that difficult. Here we go. All right, it was founded in about 307 BC, but it was this idea that teaches the greatest goods is to seek modest pleasures in order that we can obtain a state of tranquility. It sounds great, right? Like that this idea that we can have freedom from fear and absence from bodily pain, right? I mean, they were these agnostic secularists. This is their idea, what they thought of the world. And then you had the Stoics who were kind of on the other end of that. You see, Stoicism was predominantly a philosophy of personal ethics. And it was informed by its system of logic and its views on the natural world. They had a big, strong belief in the unity of everything, that everything was connected. That it was all controlled by the same thing, that we should all do our part in nature's plan. And so they were more pantheists than anything. And they argued for the unity of humanity and kinship with the divine. But there was another group there. I don't know if you caught it or not. It was the others. Right? It said some of them viewed Paul as this proclaimer of a foreign gods because Paul was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. Now, Luke does a great job of the reaction to Paul, and he sums it up in two ways. And one of them was babbler. Did you catch that? It says babbler. That what does this babbler wish to say? Now, the babbler, the term literally meant, it referred to birds that pick up seeds. It's a strange term to use, right? But he's saying that Paul's reasoning is someone who picks at ideas like a chicken or a bird who picks at seed. Someone who speaks to them without fully understanding. So you can imagine like, hey, this is what they're calling him, a babbler. Like, have you ever been around a babbler or somebody who like didn't really know what they were talking about, but they thought they knew what they were talking about? Like, this is what this idea is. Like, it's not a compliment. Right? They're not complimenting Paul when they refer to him as a babbler. And then the others referred to his idea of he's talking about some foreign gods, these ideas that we don't know about yet. I mean, these philosophers are trying to insult him. They were trying to discredit him. They're trying to make it sound as if if what he said couldn't make sense. But Paul doesn't get offended by the remarks. Paul just continues. Look what he says in the next few verses. He says, and they took him and they brought him to Areopagus, saying, may we know what his new teaching is what his new teaching is that you are presenting. For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean. Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. So Paul was brought to this court of Areopagus, which is like where the authority of all civil law and religious life would have gone on. I mean, it was a powerful place. They would literally regulate city life. They would regulate education. They would talk about philosophical lectures. They would discuss public morality. They would look at foreign cults. I mean, this is where everything went down, where they discussed all of the things. I mean, this is where the Athenians would have discussed all sorts of topics of interest and curiosities. This was also where the brightest minds in the whole world would have been gathered together to discuss this new trendy ideas that were popping up in their culture. So it's evident that these people were clearly searching for something. They're searching for acceptance and an approval and a place to belong. I mean, the Athenians were seeking to find truth, and they were open to hear what Paul had to say. They said, tell us more about it. We want to hear more of what you have to say. So Paul's got this audience, and he begins to shift his message to address those of the Areopagus. This is what he says. It says, so Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way that you are very religious. Now, this is probably a rendering of what it may have looked like, right? Like Paul standing in front of these people, these bright minds, these people very wise and knowing, the thinkers of the day. He's standing in the middle of this council. And he starts by complimenting the philosophers on their religiousness. Now it's interesting because they were idolaters, right? Remember, they didn't worship the one true God. But he said, hey, I perceive in every way that you are very religious. Paul's approach is something we can take note of because he's building common ground by leading with praise rather than accusation. He didn't immediately start to condemn these people. He said, hey, I perceive that you are in every way very religious. And then he continues, he says, for as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore your worship as unknown, I proclaim to you. So Paul was being observant. That's what I love about Paul. Like he was paying attention. He was being observant. He was aware of their culture. Like he knew what was going on in their city. He didn't just walk into this blindly. He did his research. I mean, even their use of idols, Paul recognized that they had some sort of desire and they were attempting to grasp at God. I mean, they had a whole temple dedicated to the one they don't know yet. Like, hey, we want to make sure we cover our bases, so we're even going to make a temple to the unknown God. Like, in case we missed one, there it is, right? Like, these are what they're grasping at. And if we're to model Paul, then we need to understand the culture. What entertains it? What political views do they hold? Like how do they view spirituality and morality and philosophy? You see, Paul models how to gently confront the non-believer. And this is the argument that he makes. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heavens and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. Paul is identifying God, the one true God, the one they don't know yet, as superior than to all the lesser gods that they've been worshiping in these temples. I mean, can you picture Paul pointing to the magnificent buildings around him, the ones that were constructed in the honor of these false gods, these incredible buildings, these statues, these idols, and you see him just pointing to them and say, hey, that building can't contain the one true God. The places where you go and make sacrifices all the time that are not capable of containing the true God. Because Paul is arguing that God is the creator of it all and it can't be contained by a man-made building. And so he continues this speech, and he says, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and that boundaries of their dwelling place. He's referring to Adam. He's going back to this idea, one man referring to Adam. Hey, we all started in the same place. We all have the same common ground. We may look different, think different, act different, but we all have the same place. And this idea would have appealed to the Stoics, right? Like, remember, they were all about unity, and so they were like, hey, okay, we can gather with this idea. They had this strong sense of human brotherhood. It's like, so we get this idea. Okay, we're tracking with you, Paul. Tell us more. He argues that all the descendants are from one man and that it should promote unity. And the thing is, it should eliminate all sorts of racism or separation because we're all from the same place. And that is what Paul is arguing here with these philosophers. He's also telling us about the sovereignty of God, right? And the importance, because these people are currently worshiping these lifeless, man-made idols. He's arguing that, hey, what you are searching for, what you are looking to fill that void with, can only be filled with the one true God, the one you don't know yet. He's the only one who can meet your needs. And so he kind of tells them what they should do. He said that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not that far from each one of us. Paul's appealing to them again and showing that God has some sort of has a personal nature to him, unlike their lifeless idols. He's showing that God wants a relationship with us and that we should seek him in a hope that God will reveal himself to them. Like, I love the descriptive language Paul uses when he says that we should feel their way toward him. Like, have you ever walked into a dark room that you're not familiar with? Like, you walk into the room, and like I did this yesterday when I walked upstairs to do something with the computers, and I had no idea where the light switch was. And I was literally felt ridiculous as I walked around in the dark by myself doing this because I couldn't see anything, right? Like, maybe you've been there before where you're just trying to find the light switch because you know if I can just turn the light switch on, it'll change everything and my eyes will be open and I can see. That's what Paul is hinting at. We end up trying to grasp. He wants them, he say, hey, we're feeling towards them. I understand you're looking in the dark, you're grasping for something, but he's not actually that far because he's revealed himself to us. This is what Paul is alluding to. Paul encourages them that God is always near and that he's always present and that he knows people's prayers and their thoughts. He's lending an invitation. There is a God to find, and he's actually not that hard to find because he's actually revealed himself to us already. And then he appeals to their world. He appeals to their culture. Look what he says in verse 28. He says, for in him we live and move and have our being. As even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Now sometimes Paul takes this interesting approach. He begins to quote pagan Greek writers. Now, that's an interesting way to present the truth of Jesus, right? Like he's quoting pagan Greek writers, but why? Because in their context, they would have understood. Paul isn't quoting scripture because to them he knows that they wouldn't even validate it. So he begins to allude to the truths of scripture, but with not actually sourcing it. Now, he's culturally relevant, but he doesn't shy away from the truth. He turns a culturally relevant conversation into a gospel conversation. And how is he able to do that? It's because he's well-read. He's a student of the culture. And he's at a point he's able to draw from their current context and sources. And so he's communicating in their language. And now he can begin to share truth because he's earned some credibility with them. And this is what he goes on to say. He says, being then, because remember he just said, your poet said this, for we are indeed his offspring. He said, being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. And so at this point, Paul shifts gears and begins to condemn idolatry. Now, he doesn't call any certain philosophy school out, right? He shares this truth with grace. But he says that God is greater, more complex, and more wonderful than the things that we could create because he created us. Like, how arrogant was we be if we think that we can create a God who created us? And then he moves into this appeal to Christianity, and he begins to separate himself from the philosophers in front of him, and he says this. He says, the times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. Because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the whole world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. He calls for a response. He calls them to repent. He warns of a judgment that is coming. He's saying, hey, you need to repent because judgment is coming. He's not overly concerned about being culturally relevant, that he removes the central parts of the message. Are we tracking? Like, the message never changes, but our methods do. Right? The gospel isn't going to change from Paul's day to today. And we can't sacrifice the message to reach people, but our methods need to change to adapt to our culture. But he begins to draw on biblical language, right? Without directly quoting the scriptures, because he knows that they don't see it as authoritative. They're gonna throw it out. They're gonna say, I don't believe in that. Don't quote the Bible to me. Maybe this sounds familiar. But he's trying to explain to them that Jesus isn't just some religious teacher, that he's much more than that a judgment is coming, that he died and rose again, and because of his resurrection, it is at the center of God's plan for history. The resurrection places Jesus at the right hand of God. It shows his authority to be judge, and it gives him the power to give us makes him the giver of our salvation. Right? Like if the resurrection isn't true, then we're all sitting in this room for no reason. Like, our faith rises and falls on the resurrection of Jesus being validated. And so Paul is emphasizing it here. Paul is describing it, and this was their response. He says, now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. But others said, we will hear you again about this. And so Paul went on from their midst. But some men joined him. Among those were Dionysus, I can't pronounce this word, the Areopagite. Is that close? Anybody? Okay, awesome. And a woman named Damaris, right? And others with them. Some rejected Jesus and mocked Paul's beliefs. Some rejected him and they mocked Paul in the process. But Paul doesn't let it bother him. Others responded, we will hear you again about this. That they were willing to hear more, that they weren't turned off by the way that Paul presented it, that because Paul presented the truth of the gospel in an effective way. And then some joined him. Dionysus actually became the first bishop of Athens. He was a person in the school of the Areopagus, right? Like, he was like on the council, but he walks away from all of that to follow Paul because he believes He accepted Jesus, right? And we see this. I mean, he was actually venerated as a saint in not only the Catholic Church, but also the Eastern Orthodox Church. And if you know anything about those two churches, like for them to agree on anything is pretty good. And it's all because Paul effectively engaged the Athenians with the gospel. We share the message, Jesus does the saving, but we need to share the message well. And here's why all this is important. The college campus, in my opinion, is a modern-day Athens. There is no other place on earth where thousands of 18 to 22-year-olds gather together in a few square miles. Like, think about it. Thousands of 18 to 22-year-olds, or 18 to 23, or however old they may be. Maybe they're on, extra victory lap number 6. I don't know, whatever it may look like. Tomorrow, we'll gather together in a few square miles. And that only happens in certain cities in our country because where the universities are. The future world leaders are there. And they're all searching for the same thing: acceptance, approval, and a place to belong. They're seeking to find truth. And surprisingly or not, they're very open to hear it. They're open to hear what we have to say. In my kind of research and studies with learning about college campuses especially, it says roughly about 5% of college students on a college campus are reached. That means connected to some sort of campus ministry, some sort of local church. 5%. That means 95% of the students that are on a college campus, no one's fighting for. I'll let you go home and do the math at how many students are right down the road from us and do that when you get home. That's your homework, okay? It's a lot. And here's another reason why it's important, because typically the friends that a freshman makes the first 2 to 3 weeks of the fall semester, so the first semester that they are in school, typically the friends that they make those first couple of weeks end up being the people they spend the most time with for the next 4 years of their life. So in 21 days, they find the people that they're going to spend the next 4 years with. The friend choices that an 18-year-old on their own for the very first time that they make in the first few weeks of school that they're in a brand new place can change the trajectory of their entire life. I mean, think back to when you were an 18-year-old. It's kind of scary, right? No pressure, seniors, right? like it can change the trajectory of your entire life, of their entire life, because your future world leaders are all gathered together in the same place, and that is why it is so important. And that's why reaching the college campus has the potential to change the world. But it's not just the students. You see, the Areopagus is like the faculty lounge. Paul spoke at the marketplace and the synagogues, and then he got an opportunity to sit down at the table with the brightest minds in the world. And it should give us a priority to not just reach students, but also the faculty. Because they're shaping the minds of our future world leaders. And if you're a faculty member or a professor at MTSU, thank you. Because you are shaping the minds and have an opportunity to share perspective when the opportunity arises to share real truth along with academics. I mean, some of the world's brightest minds are teaching or are members of faculty on our college campuses. Some of the brightest minds in our world today still. So how do we approach reaching those professors with the gospel? How do we approach that? I mean, in this pluralistic culture that we're in, the gospel message sometimes it just doesn't get any traction with the minds of non-believers. So what are we supposed to do about it? I mean, I think sometimes as Christians, we expect non-believers to be held to the same standards as believers, but without the relationship with Jesus. And so we've got to start there. But instead, we need to speak in terms that are acceptable and meaningful to our audience. Well, we won't be heard, and we're going to have little influence. And I think we can learn from Paul this morning. So I think there's kind of 4 takeaways that we can walk away from this passage this morning that can help us to do that. And the first one is that we got to be provoked but not offended. We've got to be provoked but not offended. You see, before I got into college ministry about 4 years ago, I spent most of my time in student ministry. And so still to this day, I love high school, I love middle schooler students, I love hanging out with them. They're wild and crazy and will keep you up all night when you spend a weekend with them. But they're exciting. And so when I moved into college ministry, I was like, okay, this shouldn't be too hard. A high school senior and a college freshman, they're like the same age. Should be the same, right? The transition shouldn't be difficult. It's going to be the same sort of struggles and issues and all sorts of things. So when I first moved to college ministry, it was in the middle of a spring semester. So I said, hey, I'm going to go join this campus event that's going on. And the campus we were serving was University of Louisiana Monroe, and they're the Warhawks. And so we were there, and they have this event called Ooze Ball. Now, Ooze Ball was this campus-wide event where a lot of the campus organizations would be a part of. They would have a team and compete. Now, it was a giant volleyball tournament. We're like, why isn't it called volleyball? Why is it called Ooze Ball? Here's why, because they would actually take a backhoe and they would dig out these volleyball courts about 2 feet deep. Yeah, they put a net in the middle, all right? But before they would do anything else, they would fill it full of water. Now you know where the ooze comes from, okay? So it would be, as you can imagine, very oozy. It would be muddy, it would be water, and then they would play. College students are awesome, aren't they? Like, this is what they did for fun in the afternoon on a Friday, okay? This was what was going on. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to go. Our college ministry had put a team together. I was like, cool, we'll go support them. We'll go watch them play Ooze Ball. I'm going to stay as far away from the water pit as possible so I don't get thrown in. But when I walked onto this field, the first group of people I walked up to, I was kind of caught off guard. And I'm not trying to poke fun or make fun of anybody's choices, but I walked up and there was a very manly college student man, a guy, wearing a dress. Now, he was just spectating. I was unsure. I was like, at first, honestly, if I'm honest with you, I was like, is that a guy in a dress or a very manly girl? I couldn't tell. And so I was like, okay, I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to go find our teams. I'm going to go find our students, and we're gonna celebrate them playing Ooze Ball and the fun choices that they're making with their Friday, right? And so I get there, watch them play a couple games. I come back around, and I see this person again. But this time I see that the team they've been supporting, they have on these white shirts, and they've got letters on them, and I'm trying to read these shirts without staring. You know, those opportunities, you're trying to figure something out, but you're like, okay, I'm not staring, but like, what's your shirt say? Okay, and once I put it all together, I realized the shirt's spelled LGBTQ. I think that's in the right order. And so I began to understand, okay, this is their campus organization. Those who leave alternative lifestyles. And I was like, in that moment, I felt God whisper to me like, hey, welcome to college ministry. It's not the same. Because I would say most schools and high school students, most students, that's probably not as open as that. The thing was, there was plenty of other campus organizations that were doing their own things that we can condemn as well, right? But this is what I saw, and this is what God whispered to me. But here's the thing, if it provokes God, then it should provoke us. If it doesn't break your heart, then you won't do anything about it. If this idea that it is robbing worship from the Lord doesn't provoke you, then you should check your heart. But here's what I've also learned is that the lost don't break our heart if we don't have any lost friends. If we can't put a face to a them, then it doesn't break our heart. But we can't just stop at being provoked. Because I would say a lot of times the church is really good at getting provoked, but it's not really good at the other part, which I said is we've got to be provoked but not offended. We must be unoffendable. Like if Paul would have gotten offended and began to rant on Facebook about all the philosophers calling him names, he wouldn't have had an opportunity to be used by God. He wouldn't have gotten a seat at the table. He wouldn't have gotten to go into the court. Like he would have been like, hey man, like he would have walked off, stormed off and been like, I'm going to write a Yelp review about the Athens and see how they're so mean. Like that's what he would have done, right? Like had he been offended. I mean, how often have we let our pride get in the way of being used by God? I know I have. Don't talk about me like that. Paul was unoffendable, and because of that, he was invited into the room and he was given a seat at the table. Man, I've seen so many Christians ruin their witness by being so easily offended by the pushback of the world. I told myself a long time ago that I wouldn't engage in any sort of social media debate. But here's the thing, being unoffendable gets noticed by the world. You see, one time when I was in college, I said, okay, I would like to speak into this moment, but I need to be very careful on how I do it. There's a guy I kind of knew from high school. He was not a believer, and he was very vocal on his beliefs of not believing in Jesus and how he began to tear apart the Bible and all the different things. And so we began to engage in a conversation, again, in a public forum, right? But we both left that conversation. I would love to tell you we left that conversation and he is now a follower of Jesus, but I don't know. We both left that conversation, me believing one thing and him believing the other, and we were perfectly fine with that. But I share that because what happened after the conversation was over, see, he actually messaged me in a private forum and said, hey, thank you for being one of the first Christians I've ever met that can have a civil conversation about what you believe. He was blown away that I didn't get offended by him not believing what I believed. Because what I've learned is the gospel is offensive enough to the world. We don't need to present it in an offensive way. The gospel is going to offend people, and that's okay as long as we don't offend people while we present it. You know, tracking with me? Like this is what's happening. So we've got to be provoked, but not offended. The second takeaway I think you can walk away with is this: we got to know your audience. You've got to know your audience, right? Like we have been given areas of influence in ways that we are gifted. You're better than something than I am, and hopefully I'm better at something than you are. But like we've all been gifted differently. We've all been given pockets of influence. But we won't be as effective as we can just in our giftedness alone. We've got to know our culture. When I was in high school, one of my friends, he was probably the most physically gifted person I'd ever met and seen in real life. Like he was 6'1", he weighed 215, he had 6% body fat, he could squat 500 pounds, he bench pressed 350, he ran a 4.4, you're like, man, is he in the NFL? No, he played fullback because he didn't understand the game of football. He couldn't catch. He couldn't play linebacker because he didn't understand lanes and tackling schemes. He couldn't be running back because he didn't have enough vision. They put him at fullback because hey, maybe you can run into that guy. Hey, there's one guy on the field, you block him and you're good. You'd be like, what a waste of talent, right? He was so gifted, but he didn't understand the game. He didn't understand the playbook. We must be a student of the culture so that we can engage it effectively. We've got to know the playbook. You could be the most gifted person in the world, the most knowledgeable person when it comes to this Bible, but how does that translate into our culture? Because somebody's going to come up to you and be like, I don't believe that thing. I don't believe that it has authority. I don't believe that it is truthful. And then where do you go from there? You're like, oh, that was the one thing I had, right? Because we got to be a study. We got to know our audience. But it can't just stop there. I think the third thing I want you to see is that we got to share truth with urgency. Share truth with urgency, right? Like Paul is saying that God is the creator of the universe, right? He made the world. He's the Lord of heaven and earth, right? He does not live in a temple made by man. This is who he is. It's not by human hands. He's the creator of the universe. But he also shares the truth that God is the sustainer of life. That he gives all of life his breath. He gives all of life their breath. And he gives them what they need. He's the sustainer of life, but he's also the ruler of all nations. And he's created every nation, and he's determined their rise and fall. But he's also the father of mankind. And Paul begins to list all these things out, right? From God we come, and in him we live, and have our very being is in him. But he doesn't end there. He doesn't stop. He shows the urgency because God is the judge of the world. What ignorance he may have overlooked in the past is no longer the case. He now commands all men everywhere to repent. Why? Because judgment is coming. He says that God will judge the world in righteousness and that God will judge the world through Jesus Christ. But you know the really cool thing about all of these things about God is that all of these things, that same God desires a relationship with you. The one who created heaven and earth, who created everything that we know, all the planets, all the stars, our earth, he desires a relationship with you. But you want to know something else? That same God desires a relationship with the person that you disagree with too. The one who believes differently than you, the one who looks different than you, the one who talks different than you, the one that lives a different lifestyle than you. That's why we must have urgency. See, when I was growing up, I always had this idea of urgency thrown to me, or the idea of sharing the gospel, like we're all sitting on a boat. Like if we're in church, like we're on the boat. If you're a Christian, we're on the boat. And those who don't know Jesus are bobbing around in the water, like think Titanic, right? Like they're all out in the water. And all we've got to do is take the gospel, which would be a life vest, and we've just got to throw it to them, and they can either accept it or they can reject it. If they accept it, they'll be saved. If they reject it, they're going to perish. And that sounds good, and that sounds great, and it tracks. But here's where it breaks down. You see, here's where the urgency part comes, is that the people who don't know Jesus, the lost, they're not bobbing around in the water. They're actually at the very bottom of the ocean because they've already drowned. And they need Jesus to come along and rip them up out of the water and breathe new life into them, because sin doesn't make us sick, it makes us dead. I don't know about you, but dead people can't do anything. They need someone to come along to share the message of the gospel with them so that Christ can pull them up and give them life. So we've got to share the truth with urgency. 95% of students walking on the college campus tomorrow are walking around dead. I'd be willing to say probably a good percentage of your coworkers are walking around your workplace tomorrow dead. But it can't stop there, you see. We've got to give an opportunity for them to decide. We can't make the decision for them. Whether it's our children, our grandchildren, a friend, a coworker that we care about, we can't decide for them. They've got to decide on their own whether they want to accept Jesus or reject him. And that's why the task is so crucial. That's why it's imperative for us to learn to be effective and not merely faithful. We got to connect with our culture, as Paul did, right? Because it'll help us share the gospel in such a way that hopefully more would come to believe and be saved. It's one of the many things I love about Calvary. It's one of the things that appealed to us when we had conversations with Steve and y'all and the staff here. Like, we just knew that y'all get it. Like, the church here gets it. Whether it's leading worship in a style that appeals to the culture, or whether it's spending our money that shows our community that we're invested in them, and those who can't afford it, or those who need help, that we're seeking justice for others. Like, you get it. Whether it's community that we see in our connect groups, like, I don't know if you know this or not, but most churches don't have 80% of their people in circles. But what will we do with it? I had a friend of mine named Shane Pruitt tweet this the other day. He said, churches that are constantly mocking and complaining about young people will always struggle in reaching them. The call is to disciple and equip them, not criticize and embarrass them. A lot of churches aren't having college students lead them in worship this morning. Students, here's the thing. Y'all aren't the future generation of the church. You're the current generation of the church. Don't let anybody tell you any different. You are the church now, not tomorrow only, but now and tomorrow. But for us to fully grasp this, to be effective, we've got to follow Paul's example, right? Like, we've got to be provoked but not offended. We've got to know your audience. You've got to share the truth with urgency. We've got to give them an opportunity to decide. Because you are worth Jesus to God. Think about it. Like, he gave Jesus to save you. So how will you respond? We have the same three options that Paul did, the same three options that Paul gave the Athenians. We can reject him, we can accept him, or see other. He laid it out in those last three verses in chapter 17 of Acts. We can be the one to reject Jesus just like the group did and mock Paul. We can be the one to accept Jesus and walk with him and follow him, follow Paul, or other, be the one who's willing to leave the door open and continue to investigate. And I don't know where you're at this morning. Maybe you're trying to figure those three options out. But what I do know is that you've got a God in heaven, the creator of the universe, who loves you and desires a relationship with you. That he's given you a purpose, and he wants to see you step into that purpose. And so, church, I don't know what God's calling you today, but I know he's calling you to something. And as the church, we need to start to treat people like Jesus died for them. But just like the song we sang earlier, because he's worthy of it all. I mean, what provokes you? Does it provoke you enough to realize that God is worthy of the praise, and that should drive us to share the message of the gospel? That, hey, what you're worshiping isn't worthy of praise, but Jesus alone is. students are missing it. 95%. Your coworkers are missing it. Your friends, maybe your family are missing it. God deserves the glory. So will you make that commitment this morning to say, I will take the message to them because God alone deserves it all? I hope you will. Let's pray.